Hello everyone and welcome to the next in our series of In Conversation events. My name is Claire Gomez and I'm the Assistant Director at Workplace Foundation, which is an institutional gallery space and charity based in Newcastle upon Tyne. Workplace Foundation supports emerging and underrepresented artists with a specific commitment to UK art scenes outside of London, focusing on the north of England. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a mixed race cisgender woman. I have brown hair that's tied in a bun. I'm wearing a black wool jumper and I'm in a white room with drawers in the background. This week, artist Karanjit Panesar will be in conversation with founder and director of Lux, Benjamin Cook. Karanjit Panesar is a multimedia artist based in Leeds. He is co-founder and co-director of UWE Bristol Contemporary, a member of Serf, Leeds, and graduated from UWE Bristol in art and visual culture. Panesar has exhibited nationally, including Parts of Wholes at Workplace Foundation in Newcastle upon Tyne, Actor Container at Two Queens in Leicester, Strange Loops at Turf Projects in Croydon, and The Way Things Are at Arebyte Gallery in London. Recently, he has undertaken eXRe commission with Aspex Gallery Portsmouth in association with CCIXR University of Portsmouth. Benjamin Cook is the founder and director of Lux, the UK agency for the support and promotion of artists working with moving image. He has been professionally involved in independent film sector in the UK for the past 20 years as a curator, archivist, producer, writer, and lecturer. Before founding Lux, he held a number of positions, including director of the Lux Centre, head of distribution of London Electronic Arts, director of London Pan-Asian Film Festival, avant-garde programmer for the National Film Theatre, film archivist for Anthology Film Archives, New York, the Northern Film Archive, Gateshead, and the Wellcome Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce Karanjit and Ben, who will be in conversation this evening. Towards the end of the conversation, I'll join and ask any questions from the audience, which you can type using the Q&A function. For now, I'm going to disappear into the background. Welcome to you both.
This is Ben speaking. So thank you very much, Claire. So I am a middle-aged white man with brown wavy hair. I'm wearing glasses. I've got a greying beard. And I'm wearing a blue shirt and have a kind of a beigey blank background. And I have a kind of, for some reason, like a kind of 70s style, kind of hazy dreaminess about my image. So Karanjit, do you just want to introduce yourself first?
Sure, yeah, hi. So my name is Karanjit. I'm cisgendered male. My pronouns are he, him. I have wavy black hair and a black beard. I'm wearing a white jumper. I'm in my bedroom and my background is blurred, so you can't see how messy it is. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, this is Ben speaking again. We just before we came online, we were just talking about images, calling up some images of the show, but because this is a kind of talk in relation to an exhibition that happened at Workplace Foundation, I thought perhaps we could cast ourselves back to that time it was the spring to early summer of 2022. And I just wanted to ask Karanjit first if perhaps we could just like describe the show a bit, like give us a bit of a kind of virtual walkthrough. It might be nice to just have that as a kind of as like a kind of audio presentation.
Yeah, no, that's a really good idea. Yeah. So for anyone that hasn't been to Workplace Foundation, it's there are two gallery spaces in a kind of L shape. So you come in through the front door and you're in a sort of lateral exhibition space. And in this front room, there were drawings on the wall, A4 pencil and paper drawings. I think there were 5 in that front room, kind of dotted around, a couple on one wall and a few on another wall adjacent to it. And there was also a flat screen monitor that was showing a loop of a super slow motion CGI rendered piece of cloth that I modeled. And it was about 2 minutes long. And it was just a kind of crop of a corner of a piece of virtual fabric that was sort of billowing in this fake wind, virtual wind. And so then between the two spaces on the kind of L shape, through the doorway. I had a pair of profile faces that were kind of full height of the doorway, and so you had to walk through them, and they were painted green color, and it's they're actually painted a specially formulated chroma key green paint that's used in VFX and post-production. So it's like a green screen chroma key paint. So you had to walk through these two faces that were kind of like that. And then in the second room, it was a darkened sort of cinema space. And there was a big screen showing a film, a couple of benches, and then some more drawings on the wall. And then, surprise, behind the screen were a few onions scattered on the ground, and another drawing. Yeah, so that was a kind of run through of the.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I completely missed the onions.
Yeah, Easter egg.
That's good to hear. I wonder. So the show is called Parts of Wholes. That seems really significant in relation to what your kind of description of the show. And I guess I'm always interested, especially in terms of things that include moving image. How you can kind of conceptualize those things fitting together, because I suppose as somebody involved in moving image in art, it's always this kind of the strength of it and the kind of weakness of it is its awkwardness. That basically you have a medium that is fundamentally kind of like temporal and dematerialized in a kind of space, like the kind of space that prioritizes the object. And so I just wondered if you could say something about the kind of, maybe about the title of that show, and about how you feel that kind of construction works, like what's the kind of interplay between these different kind of works, or perhaps they're all one work, I'm not sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess the title, it's something I think about a lot, is how things fit kind of inside each other, and it kind of relates to the content of the film, as well as the different elements that are in the show as a whole. I guess going to speak about the drawings briefly, they're well, maybe not briefly, but they're A4 drawings of they're kind of fantastical portraits of people that don't really exist. And yeah, I've always drawn scribbled these kind of faces, but I've never really shown them until recently. But as I've made more films, I think I'm kind of wondering about how they fit into that. And I like making films with people. I often work with actors, and so I think the drawings, I like the way you might watch a film, be distracted and look over somewhere and see a person looking back at you from a drawing, and then kind of look back to the film, and how there might be a kind of conversation happening there, as well as there being a conversation between the green faces that you walk through. And then the drawings were kind of in pairs, a lot of them, and it's just really, a lot of the drawings are in profile, or like a kind of 2/3 turn thing, and it's just kind of amazing how much tension you can create by just having two human faces looking at each other, or kind of like in proximity to each other. I spent quite a lot of time pairing them up and seeing which ones felt right or didn't feel right, or having people turn looking away from each other has a completely different sort of feeling to them both looking the same way or looking at each other. And then there are frames in the film which follows two people where they're looking at each other, or they're looking away from each other, or they're in conversation, or they're kind of distanced, and so there's a conversation happening there as well. I think kind of more generally, and to kind of talk about what you were talking about film being awkward. Yeah, I I often make films to be within exhibitions or within a context where there are objects as well. And yeah, I kind of like that back and forth between other things that might be in the room, and then kind of thinking about a film as like a way to generate like a flow of attention or something, where you might see some stuff, some sculpture or drawings or some other kind of work, and then see a film and then go back to the same works, and they've kind of shifted slightly, or they've kind of like moved a little bit in the way that you'd think about them or see them. And so yeah, I kind of like using film as another object in a way, in a space. Yeah, and I think as well with I mean, we'll talk about this more, I guess, but like the film plays on a loop, and so which is something I do a lot of, because I really enjoy presenting film on loop in a kind of exhibition context, in like an installation context, where the loop is sort of important to the work, and you can kind of play with the duration of the thing, and then the duration is either like, you know, infinite until you press stop on the media player or you turn the show off, or it's kind of, you know, negligible, or it doesn't like exist. It's sort of like it's like something you don't really think about anymore. And so then I just find it really interesting how you might start thinking about it as something other than a film. It's like a sort of object or something that is just has an appearance that is moving, rather than it being like a start and finish thing.
Oh, that's really interesting that you say that, because I suppose there is often this kind of like tension, I think, around yeah, like how does kind of moving image operate as an artwork in some ways, or what it's like, you know. So sometimes actually when I think about kind of loops and things like that, I think about this almost like, sometimes people talk even about this kind of idea of a, you know, like a kind of moving painting or something like that, you know, something that is fairly fairly kind of static, or fairly comprehensible in a kind of limited time. But I suppose what's interesting about your films is they are, you know, the language of them is film, you know. In some ways they're really consummately produced. They're really, you know, make you feel they're really well made, they're really well written. Like, you obviously have a real kind of skill for working with actors and things like that. So in some ways the kind of language of the language of them as well is, you know, they're like, you know, I don't really have the right language for this, but like films in some way, you know, you're obviously engaged with that kind of language as well, you know, in terms of, I mean, this is a difficult kind of conversation really to think about, like, but I find myself in this kind of situation a lot where people are like, well, what's an artist film? You know, like, how's that different? You know, and you know, usually my answer to that would be, yeah, it's kind of almost like a kind of attitude in some ways, where it's like an intentionality. It's not like a genre, but people make that mistake quite often, you know. Definitely in film terms, there is this kind of there is this drive to kind of define everything, and there's this thing about like genre, you know, there is this kind of thing about genre and tropes, you know, and this idea of kind of pigeonholing everything and saying, oh yeah, no, I understand what this is a, you know, this is a romantic comedy, and this is a western, and this is an artist film. But in a way, it seems to me with your work, at least with this actor contained especially, it seems this is really, you know, it's really it could be, you know, it's playing with the expectations of the audience, you know. It's recognizable, it's legible in those kind of terms for anybody that watches films, TV, things like that. It has a kind of legibility, and in a way the friction of it comes from defying of those expectations.
Mm.
Sorry, I'm just like talking at you, but do you
Uh,
agree with those? Do you agree with that idea? I mean, you interested, it seems to me that you are interested in the language of film, and that you are consciously working with these kind of these maybe confusions, or this way of reading, defying those expectations.
mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's it's a kind of key part of the way I think about making films, I guess, is that yeah, I mean, I just think we all consume so much media through films and Netflix, and the amount of series that we all watch and talk about, and it's like all of these things are built around characterization and like narrative. And so I guess it's sort of like double pronged, because one of them is that there is this thing about expectation, and like I really like the fact that you come into a gallery space and see a film with a script and with actors and people talking, and it's like, oh, I know how to watch this. It's like sometimes when you go into a show or encounter like a piece of artist moving image or artist film or something, and it's like I personally sometimes feel like I'm missing a trick. It's like, oh, there's like something here that I don't know about, or I feel a bit like, I don't know, there's a sort of opacity to them or something. But with something that's acted and performed and shot in a certain way, you come in and you're like, oh, I'll watch it because it's following a story, like when you watch a film or watch a TV show or something. So in a way, it's like kind of hooking people in and then messing with their expectations when they're already watching it. So with the loop of actor container, for example, it's like, the structure of it is that there are kind of nested levels of filmic reality, or like narrative reality, and the film, we kind of go between them and end up back at the start, and it kind of loops around, which isn't really like a new thing. Like that happens all the time in films, but it's not often that you get to watch a film and see it actualized. It's always implied. Like it gets to the end of the film and it's like, oh, we're at the start, or it's like, oh, that person was that person the whole time, and then the credits roll, and and it's like, oh, that was the thing. But with like a film on loop in a gallery context or an exhibition context, it actually happens, and I find that really interesting as like a fairly simple gesture. It's like a film that doesn't end. I kind of like the simplicity of that. But then as well, it's kind of, I guess, I use that language of film to talk, I guess, about the way in which media shapes our interior experience, and like the way, the like movie effect thing, where like, you're in a car and the right song comes on and you're looking out the window and it's like, I'm in a film. And how like an authentic experience is now, for me, it's like I'm channeling it through cinematography. I'm channeling it through like the shots that I'm seeing as I'm walking down the street, of being like, there's that John Smith film of like, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like the corner of the street in London, and he's like narrating everything that happens. It's like a bit like that, I suppose. It's like everyone is within this reality that is being reflected back to us all the time through TV and film and media. And it's like, what does it then mean to be doing the stuff that then becomes the film? I don't know. There's something about that I find really interesting, and is kind of can be spoken about by using that language.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I suppose you know, you're right that there, you know, well, one thing that is interesting about working with moving images, unlike other mediums, the audience is really literate.
Mm.
You know, anybody that watched TV or films growing up, they, you know, they do have this incredible ability, like we all have, and like you said, the kind of blurriness of that as well, but we have this incredible ability to make meaning. I mean, I actually, you know, have, you know, I'm not sure if I said this to you before, but, you know, I have this theory, this is why people often really hate artist films because, you know, they have, you know, especially maybe ones, not, I don't mean yours, but I mean, you know, just as a kind of a genre that seems like oblique and, you know, often, and I think it's often because in some ways, like, people have this literacy, you know, and in some ways we're so, you know, it's an unconscious literacy because we're so programmed, especially around the kind of narrative sensibility and things. You know, we understand, we implicitly understand the rules, don't we? Things like camera setups, like shot, you know, this classic shot reverse shot, like nobody would, when you try to explain that to somebody, they probably couldn't understand it. But if they saw something, that line being broken in a film, then they would know, they would have this implicit sense of wrongness about it. They would immediately recognize that something was wrong, even if maybe they couldn't describe it or something. So I think it's really interesting, you know, and I often think like people should, like, artists should understand that more, that, you know, you're dealing with a very sophisticated audience, you know, that's going to bring a lot of expectations and a lot of literacy to you know, you know, so that's interesting. And another thing is just this kind of blurriness around the artness of the, I don't know what the correct technical term is, but like the art, the patina of artness that things have as well, where, and by that I mean things that are recognizably art. So for example, if you see a painting, you know, there's no confusion there, you know it's art, and that has a certain kind of, you know, there's a certain kind of aura to that. The interesting and the complex thing with moving images is they don't necessarily have that patina of artness about them. So people don't know exactly how to approach these things, and especially, you know, when images go outside of the gallery and things like that, it starts to become very confusing about, like, you know, what's the kind of mode of viewing, because I think that's something that people don't think about enough as well, is this idea that there are, you know, things might be moving images, but there's different kinds of moving images, you know, and they might actually be different. It might demand different kinds of a positionality in terms of viewing, or a particular kinds of attention. You know, and sometimes, you know, so sometimes I built up a huge tolerance for really slow, oblique things, and in some ways, you know, like that, you know, how I would kind of explain, and sometimes I find myself trying to be generous with people and say, look, this is a different kind of experience, and you just have to like tune your brain in a different way. You know, it might not be about it might defy those expectations you have, and you might need to actually switch to some other kind of experience, which might be about allowing yourself to drift more mentally, or to notice patterning or rhythm, or these kinds of things. Whereas, you know, I mean, obviously this isn't what you're working with, you know, you are working really strongly with narrative. But yeah, I think it's a really kind of interesting field of like that kind of reception, you know, thinking about the kind of reception of works. But what I wanted to ask you more about is, you know, reading through the kind of writing around your work and the press release. I'm not sure how much they're your words and things, but there is this real kind of focus on a kind of like a kind of structuralism in some ways. You know, so obviously you talked about the loop. I know you've talked about the strange loop a lot. that's something that you kind of revisited again and again. I just wanted to ask you about, and I'm sorry because I know that you probably talked about this quite often, but that might be, I'm kind of interested, maybe if you could say maybe what that is for people that don't know what that is.
Yeah.
But what I'm interested in is knowing like what your interest is in that, and also particularly like what it does, what you think it does, like what's the effect of that, what's the affect of that in terms of, you know, and also perhaps, you know, what does it point to in terms of, you know, aesthetically or politically, or, you know.
Yeah.
So big question.
No, yeah. Yeah, strange loops are I find them like absolutely fascinating. And so a strange loop is when you move up, or this is going to sound like a really rehearsed answer, but it's when you move up or down through kind of hierarchical ontological levels. So like hierarchical levels of kind of I'm trying to think of a way to talk about ontology. It's like things inside each other again. And so like, okay, I'll talk about my film, which uses this structure. And I kind of mentioned about nested levels of reality within the film. So you have like a kind of base reality, which is fairly mundane. And it's like the characters going for a drive, and then they fill up with some petrol and they go to the shops and stuff. And then there's like another level of reality where we're kind of watching a live streamed radio show, and someone sees it on the phone, and then we kind of zoom into that world. So that level is like one below base reality, and so we live in that level for a bit of the film, and then there's that some stuff happens then, and some conversations happen then, and then there's another level above that one, which is where you hear my voice called cut, and then we're in the film set, and there's a sort of breaking of the artifice or the facade or something, and then we're in a different kind of level of reality, and then some other stuff happens, some more conversations happen, and then somebody trips over and wakes up from a dream, and they're back in base reality. And so you've ended up back at the start, and that's a strange loop where you've gone through different levels of reality, and seemingly one is like above the other or like below the other, and it doesn't really make sense. So like a easy example of a strange loop is like the chicken or egg question, because you follow it round and it goes round to the start, and one is above the other. And then also Escher drawings of the kind of impossible staircase and the waterfall that goes up, and you follow it up and it comes back down, and then it's like, oh, it's going up again. So that's kind of what a strange loop is. I think in terms of like, so like aesthetically, and in terms of like the film that I just kind of briefly described, I think as well it goes back to what I was saying about seeing it play on loop in a gallery context. And there are films that use that kind of structure of a strange loop, the narrative structure of a strange loop. But again, they like, you know, finish. And so it's quite interesting. I find it really interesting to like allow that loop to just kind of keep happening. And there's something kind of, I don't know, I find it just really oddly satisfying about the fact that this loop is just happening. It's just like kind of, when the exhibition's on and you press play, it just happens and it just keeps going until you press stop or you turn the show off. And it just feels like a little kind of black hole or something. It feels like a little kind of self-contained closed logic that is just kind of happening there. And I find that just like really, really interesting. I think there's also in fiction is people like Philip K. Dick. There's a book called Time Out of Joint, which is like a really great story, and Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said, is another one that's really good, that kind of plays with some of this. And he's like a really good author for that kind of anxious paranoia about there being the wool pulled over your eyes. So there's always some kind of conspiratorial element, and there's always some kind of like force at play that's like above you somewhere, and you exist kind of below it. And then at times the narrative pierces through that, and you get to see this thing that's above, or you get to kind of suddenly realize the level on which you live, and it's not the one that's up there that's like the real level. And so I guess the kind of political implications of that are, I don't know, it's I don't know, the big political and economic structures within which we live and think we're, I don't know, it becomes kind of conspiratorial. And I have a lot of time for like, I've got like a ongoing kind of interest in conspiracy theories and people who are conspiratorially minded, and I've like spoken to some people on Reddit and stuff, and that's kind of ongoing because I just find it like massively interesting that there's that the kind of common denominator with people who are into these nuts conspiracy theories is that there's some knowledge being kept from them, or like some kind of level of reality being kept from them that they don't have access to. And I think part of that comes from a disenfranchisement caused by capitalism and neoliberal capitalism and all of its kind of cultural logic that makes everybody feel completely powerless. And so then that kind of, in the film as well, they are, well, Sarge, one of the characters, is sort of aware of, well, he isn't aware of the loop, but he becomes, he gets quite close to the loop, being like, there's a bit where he's like, oh, I keep ending up places and I can't help it. And he starts becoming kind of slightly aware of the fact that there might be something going on that he's not really aware of. And so he's kind of struggling against this structure. So he's like within the thing that's above him, as well as there being like levels in the film.
That's interesting. I like the idea of conspiracy as a kind of structural conceptual interest in conspiracy. I suppose that idea also that there is another level, there's always another level that you don't have access to. So in a way that kind of, coming back to the strange loop idea that even if it's beyond perception. And also I suppose there is this kind of history in moving image of, definitely in the kind of early days of artists being interested in moving image as a way to, there was this really kind of, it's not, I don't think like such a kind of concern for artists nowadays, but maybe a little bit what you're talking about, this idea that there's a kind of a mass media that needs to be kind of deconstructed in some ways. And definitely in our predecessors in our organization in London Filmmakers Co-op, they were very much interested in Marxist ideas, and they were very interested in the idea of a kind of cinema that was self-aware, this idea that, if they imagine like cinema is that, a kind of opiate, sends people, it's soporific and it sends people to sleep. And they were interested in all these techniques for like, how do you smash that open, and they had lots of interesting ideas around that, things like a kind of breaking down this idea of a kind of illusionism, like being interested in kind of anti-illusionist things. And this is where you get the kind of some of this like really interminable, oblique, difficult works, because it was like, and this is something in your work as well, like this, this deconstructedness sometimes deconstructing it to the level of showing the means of production in some way, so you foreground these sort of elements, or there might be like interventions even into this kind of space of showing in some ways as well. So that idea of, if it's like this kind of dream place to like shake, have to be constantly shaking people awake in some way. So it's interesting thinking about your work in that kind of tradition as well, but in quite sophisticated, kind of narratively driven way. I wanted, like, another thing that you talk about which is another, I guess, kind of structural concern, is the relationship between like diegetic and the diegetic and the non-diegetic. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, it's something I guess thinking about the
maybe we should say what that is, actually, in case
so diegesis and like diegetic is it means, I think that it means like in the world of the story, and then non-diegetic is the opposite of that, or things that are outside the world of the story. And so, like, from an example from filmmaking, and like watching a film might be, you see somebody walking down the street and you hear their footsteps. That's an example of diegetic sound that is within the world of the story. But if there were to be a narrated voice saying something over the top, and that voice didn't belong to anybody, that was, it was a narrator, that would be non-diegetic. And then you also get things where they shift. So you might start hearing music in the soundtrack, which is non-diegetic, and then you see somebody hit stop on a radio, and so then it's kind of drifted into the world of the story, and it becomes diegetic, and you have this non-diegetic to diegetic drift, or there are terms for it, I don't know. But yeah, I kind of like the thinking about what the I guess the metaphorical potential of that structure might be, and like and especially in the terms of the I guess mechanics of film, where and again, I'm talking about narrative film, I suppose, like, where like anything is possible until something is actualized on screen. So there's like a whole world of possibility, and like any new character can be introduced to the world of the story, or any new setting or sound or anything, because you sort of, and I guess there's a parallel to drawing, whereas wherein, when you're making a drawing, you have your pencil or whatever on the paper, and you're kind of at the point of contact, and then you kind of follow it. And there's, I guess, something similar with film, in that you're like at the point of the frame that you see in the scene that you're in, and you don't really know what's coming. It's all non-diegetic, like everything exists outside of the world of the story, but like anything can be brought in, and even if it doesn't make sense in the narrative, there's always a way to smuggle it in. And I find that really interesting. And then I guess in terms of thinking again about the kind of totality of economic systems, global economic systems, or global political systems, and then thinking about that as a diegesis, and think about that as like a story world. What are the things that exist outside of that, and how can they be brought in, I suppose? I don't know, that's all just like, I don't know how to action that, but it's like an interesting sort of way of thinking about it, I think.
Yeah, that's a great idea. That's really interesting. I mean, I suppose what's interesting to me is the blowing it, because at first you think, yeah, that's quite easy to define the difference between diegesis and non-diegesis. But when you think about it, actually, it's a lot blurrier, because in a way, like coming back to your show at Workplace, is that's a diegesis. You know, the parts are, you know, that's a diegesis, isn't it? Like the whole gallery is a kind of diegesis. You've created a kind of meta diegesis in some ways. You know, when you're talking about that, the looks and things of the you know, you've like expanded the, you know. Sometimes you know, one thing that I often think about in terms of artist film is that you know, one potential difference between that artist film and like film is perhaps this kind of this idea of a kind of projected field that artist film has, you know, that whereas maybe we have a concept of a film as being being much more hermetic, you know, that it moves through a system, you know, and in a way that's like a capitalist system. You know, there's a windows of, you know, to basically maximize the income of those things. It is very controlled in terms of these kind of release windows that it moves through. You know, it has a kind of a life, and if it's going to succeed, it's going to move through that path. Whereas for an artist film, it doesn't have. It's not like the world. There's any place in the world that's waiting for an artist film to arrive. In some ways, you have to construct that. You know, you have to construct that, and that constructedness, I think, is the film as well. You know, that completes the film, and it's partly just that thing that, you know, thinking about that idea of you know, art world as a way that, as a place that fetishizes the object, the thing. You know, that kind of conjuring, that projection of that work in the site in which it happens is the completion of that work in some ways. You know, so I often encourage people to think more about that, you know, but we get caught up in this idea of film as a cultural object that it's hermetic, whereas I think for artists, films, they're much more porous, you know, in some ways, you know, they can take on these things. The other thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of the sort of diegetic, I guess, is like the kind of dance number, you know, because I really love musicals, and often I think, you know, musicals are there's a tension, isn't there? That's a real point, tension, isn't it? The dance and the music number, like, is it like, what does it, where does it sit within the diegesis? Is it, it's like a narrative rupture. It's quite subversive, isn't it?
It's like a, so where it came from was that the film was made on like a minuscule budget, and so I was filming in this filming in this like fairly cheap set in Leicester, and it was like a big sort of floor of a warehouse or something, and there was like a few different sets, and so like I went to visit the set, and they had like a kitchen and a living room and a recording studio and a Victorian sweet shop and some of the things like that, and like a nuclear bunker that he was still making upstairs. But I wrote the film based on what was available at the set, so that I could use all the different bits of it and construct this kind of like layered, you know, like it moves through the different kind of levels of the film, and each of them is kind of, so I wrote it after seeing what was there. And then also Saj, the actor, is also a Bollywood dancer, and so we were kind of chatting, and I saw it on his like casting thing that he sent to me. I thought, oh, that's quite fun, and so we kind of wrote that into it as well. So yeah, it was like an interesting one to write as well, because it was sort of it was kind of responsive to what I had available, which was, you know, a dancer, a recording studio set, and a kitchen, and then Chandni's car, and lots of the film is set in her car. So yeah, the dance bit, I mean, the film sort of goes off the rails a bit sort of before that. And I was talking about this sort of base reality thing where they're driving and whatever. And those bits are quite mundane, you know, they're pretty banal. They're just like going for a drive, they're filling up with petrol and just like having a chat. But then once they return back to their house, which is the film set, it just kind of spirals a bit. And they zoom into the phone world, and then they're in this kind of call-in situation with this ludicrous radio show. And so that kind of dropping down of the level allows you to completely change the tone of the film and change the language, and it becomes like quite intense. Actually, there's some like quite intense dialogue, and then there's like another cut, and then they do this weird sort of looping conversation where they're repeating the same lines to each other. And then I guess this is kind of, you know, what I was talking about there being like anything is possible until it isn't possible. Like, I don't think anyone, you know, the first time you watch it, it's like, who knew that he was about to get up and do like a 4-minute Bollywood dance routine? But then he falls over and wakes up, and then it becomes like, it's like, oh, of course he was going to do that. I don't know.
It's funny though, like what the you know, like maybe it's our capacity to make meaning out of things, but to me, that you know, I found that really interesting and kind of affecting that dance bit. You know, if I was like, I guess for me, I found it quite meaningful in a funny way. It was almost like it felt kind of like melancholic in a way, and it felt like he was almost like taking back agency in a funny way. He was like, it was like this kind of embodied within himself, you know, like, you know, so that's weirdly how I read it, as the kind of ending of the film, that, you know, he's cast in all of these, you know, like level shifts, and then in a way he like takes back agency at the end, you know, within himself, and it feels like quite introspective. It feels like kind of introspective and kind of weirdly emotional. I don't know if I intended that, but that was my kind of read of it.
Yeah, and he kind of, there's a sort of exploration of the set as well a little bit, because he starts off on the sofa. So you see the set twice in the duration of the loop, and once it's kind of within the narrative and you don't see any of the edges of it, and then there's a sort of rupture, there's like a break where the surface of the film is kind of broken, and then you're in this kind of structural behind the scenes sort of thing, and then you see the set again and you see all of the edges of it, and you see how it's like a ridiculous facade, you know, it's like the tiles are just like wallpaper that's peeling, and like you see all the lights and stuff, and it's like, oh, was that really, like, did I really believe that? And then when he starts the dance, there's like he's within the set, and then there's this kind of reverse kind of following shot, and he dances through the set, and there's like, you see all the lights, and you see like a runner turning on a light, and this kind of thing. So yeah, there is a sort of yeah, it kind of ties all of that together, I suppose, and then it ties together the fact that, oh, I've already seen that before, but it was their house, and now it's this kind of cheap film set that they're in, and then he does this dance, and then suddenly they're back in kind of base reality.
Yeah.
And there is actually like a diegetic thing with the music going on there, where he listens to music in his headphones, and then he wakes up in the car and it's been playing on the radio, so he turns it off, and that kind of carries him back into where he sort of I don't know, truly lives, or maybe, I don't know, maybe he doesn't, maybe he is just always dancing.
Cool. Thank you. So I'm conscious we're running out of time, and we've got a couple of questions. I mean, I can ask these, Claire, or if you want to.
I can do it, that's fine. So yeah, we've got a couple of questions from the audience. Thank you very much. That was really engaging. I really loved listening to you talk. So the first question is, what's your approach to directing the actors you work with? Are you quite hands-on in getting the performance you want, or is your process more light touch?
It's an interesting question. I think it depends. It depends on in Actor Container, which is the film that's in Workplace, the Workplace show. There are some scenes that I made them do like so many times, and they were like hating me by the end. There's like scenes in the car where maybe I shouldn't reveal this. There's like, the camera was mounted to the windscreen and I was hiding behind the driver's seat in the footwell. I was kind of tucked in, and we're like driving around the block for about 3 hours, I think, or like 2.5 hours. And I was getting them to do the same like 5-minute scene and then taking breaks. And we just did it again and again. We ended up using the last one that we shot. I think because they were slightly pissed off, and we just sort of, it felt kind of like there was some energy in it that was quite interesting. But I think a lot of the other times it is quite light touch. I'm not, I've worked with actors a few times on a few different things, but I'm by no means like, a wildly experienced director. But it's something I find really, really interesting. I love working with actors, and love, like, I have like a lot of time and respect for the craft of the actor, of like taking words off a page and giving them like an emotional resonance. And it's like the part of directing and working with actors that I always find like super, super interesting and engaging, because you can write a thing and then suddenly someone speaks it and it's like, yeah, a real thing. Yeah, I hope that answered.
I think so, yeah. Then the second question is, I was really struck by the sonic elements in your film. How important is sound and music in the development of your films?
Yeah, it is important. Films are, there's like I'm really interested in editing. I work as an editor as well. I in my paid gigs, I work as an editor, and I'm like just really interested in the art of editing. And there's an editor called Walter Murch who edited Apocalypse Now, amongst some other like really famous big films, and he's written a book called In the Blink of an Eye, and it's kind of like a reader's, what do they call it, like a sort of handbook for editing. And he talks about this thing about how you hear an image before you see an image, and that's really interesting. Like, just like pairing different kinds of music and different kinds of images creates like a completely different thing. And so like, yeah, just I think it's something that is always has to be thought about, the sonic elements and music, and the amount of play you have to move the emotion of a scene through the scoring. I was like lucky enough, I've just finished a different film, and I was lucky enough to work with the composer on that film, and that was like an incredible experience to be able to like send some rough cuts and then get back 4 or 5 different versions with different music, and being like, that's completely wrong, or that's quite close, or it's like, oh no, that's the one. And it's like, it's just amazing how you can get into someone else. Like the composer like immediately got into my head with the scene and was like, sent me a demo, and I was like, that's the scene, that's exactly the right mood of it. So yeah, really, really important.
Brilliant, thank you. And then Claire Dorset has asked, I wondered if the drawings in the exhibition were put there to also act as a way to throw a viewer out of the known filmic language you discussed towards the beginning of the talk, or how you view their role within the exhibition. I know you mentioned the idea of someone watching the film and wandering and seeing an image of someone, but there's a particular way that they are actually drawn. I just wondered if you had more to elaborate on there.
Yeah. I guess thinking about how I view them within the context of the exhibition as a whole, I guess it's like they were a sort of thread throughout the whole show, because you could follow it around the wall, and you could kind of see them, and they took you into the next space, and you could see them again. They are drawn in a kind of quite particular way. They're not like realistic, but they are representative. Well, representational. I mean, they like, you know, they are people. They're not drawn from observation or reference or anything. It's kind of a mix of what I think a face looks like, and then like occasionally studying someone's face that I'm talking to and being like, oh, that line is actually quite close to the eye when you're in this kind of angle. And then there's like a sort of they're all kind of costumey. They all have like symbols and marks and different stuff going on their faces, but they feel a bit like that's being excavated rather than applied. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't really, to be perfectly honest, I try not to think about the drawings too much. I just like to make them and kind of think about them afterwards. And so this thing of like them being characters from films or possible characters in possible films, I guess came after the fact of me having been drawing faces for like a long time, and like just finding them quite fun to doodle. Yeah, I think I did the first time I showed that film was at Two Queens in Leicester a few years ago, and in that show as well, there were kind of sculptural elements that were on the wall, and they had bits of plastic in them that was like reflecting the screen, so you could like be looking at one of the works on the wall, and in the reflection of the plastic you'd see the film playing behind you. And so then there was like shots where they're in the car, for example, and they're like looking at each other, or one's like in the foreground and one's kind of like looking like that, and then that also was happening in the work in front of you, and there was like intersections where the plastic finished, and then there was no more reflection. Yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm rambling a bit.
No, it's good. I think there's also if you kind of consider them as characters, and what you were talking about before with Easter eggs, there's one in particular that was in the exhibition that is crying tears of onions, and then you see the onion in the film that's kind of signifying that the loop has started, and then you go around to the back of the screen and you've got the onion, so it kind of all ties it together and makes this alternate world, which I think is really nice. So it's all linked, but maybe whether or not that's before, after, or during is again something for the audience to think about. I've got another question. How do you find the actors that you want to work with?
I cast them using online platforms usually. So there's one called Spotlight, which is a kind of industry standard for finding actors, where actors, agents and agencies will post their represented actors' profiles, and then you can write a character breakdown, is what they call it, like a casting breakdown, where you say, oh look, I'm looking for somebody who is within this age bracket, looks like this or not, or you can kind of set some of the parameters, and then you get sent a bunch of suggestions, and then you get sent show reels and stuff, and you shortlist. And for the film I briefly mentioned just a minute ago that I've just finished, I had 4 roles to cast, and I had something like 750 suggestions to go through. I was like, this is not going to work. But it's interesting working with actors because they're in the same boat as artists, in that they just want work and we're like always looking for like a gig. So I do feel a sort of like kindred spirit with like working with actors, even though ostensibly to them I'm like the big shot director or something who's going to give them their big break, and it's like, no, sorry. It's like, maybe, but I'm just making this sort of weird film.
There's 2 more questions. You're right to answer them, and then maybe that's enough. The strange loop concept seems very complex. How does it compare to normal films to develop and direct?
To develop it, they do take a long time. Well, they are quite complex. There's like a lot of planning and writing, and it's usually like a big sheet of paper on my wall, and like arrows and things, and like saying, oh, this is happening here, and then we could go up or down to this next thing, and then this is going to happen there, and then the same, and then it always eventually there's like a loop, which makes sense, but like on the big sheet of paper there's a loop where, and it's like, the thing about the loop is that everything exists on the loop because of something else on the loop, and they like kind of cause and effect is in this closed logic that can take a while to finesse and like consider all of the different elements that are kind of floating, and then tying it all together. It can be kind of a bit of a headache, but when you connect the loop and say like, oh, that's there because that's there, like the thing with the onions in the film is because they're like making dinner, and so it's like, oh, what do they need to make dinner? Okay, he's cooking, he's going to start with chopping and frying an onion, and so then the onion's in the car because they went shopping, and so then he hides one in the glove box to like see if it's there later, and so then so you kind of bounce around the loop. But it's interesting that after the fact it all makes perfect sense, but at the time of writing it and planning it, it's like it could be anything, it's quite kind of like arbitrary, but they sort of bounce around, and it's just like a lot of planning and directing is much the same, to be honest. You just well, the one thing about directing is you do have to kind of brief the actors, because they're expecting like, it's like, oh, is this the end of the film then? And it's like, sort of. It's like you do have to kind of manage those expectations a bit.
Brilliant. And then final question is, I assume that the process of creating one of your films takes a long time from start to finish, whereas your drawings have an immediacy to them. Do you enjoy having these differing elements in your practice?
Yeah, I do, very much. I make ceramics as well. I make pottery, which is also the same thing. It's like an immediacy that is like, it's very fulfilling. I think with making the films, which are all like there's a lot of research and a lot of planning, and there's a lot of thinking. It's really nice to like also just be able to make some drawings, or like make some pots, or make stuff with my hands that doesn't require loads of forward planning and like forward thought, and it's kind of immediate. So I do very much enjoy having different things in the work.
Well, thank you very much for your time and talking about the work. And Ben, thank you as well for your wonderful questions. I think that concludes the evening. And I just want to say a big thank you and good night. I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation and see you soon for the next In Conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks.
Cheers, Ben.